What's going on, everybody? Welcome into an all-new episode of the Pack-A-Day Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can find the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. It is great to be joined once again by the one and only Sam Monson. You can find him on social media at Sam Monson NFL. And of course, you can find him over at the 33rd Team. Sam, it has been a hot second, but it is great to be catching up with you. How the heck are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know this is a little bit of busy season with the draft coming up. So wanted to pick your brain, though, on all things Green Bay Packers. And I kind of want to start at the end of last season and then just kind of evolve the discussion through the offseason and where Green Bay is headed moving forward. But just kind of taking a moment to look back at 2024, there was expectations for this young Packers team. You had a Jordan Love series of injuries that kind of affected the team throughout the course of the season. Multiple games started or played by Malik Willis. They end up in the wild card round. They lose to Philadelphia. They end up losing their final 3 games of the season, ending up on a bit of a sour note. Didn't really quite, I think, meet those expectations, but it was not a abysmal season by any stretch of the imagination either. How did you view the Packers in 2024, what they were able to accomplish, what they weren't able to accomplish, and anything in between?
Yeah, I mean, because of the way the previous season had ended, where it was kind of this season of 2 halves, the first half wasn't great, and then they caught fire, and they were, one of the hottest teams in the NFL going into the postseason with this, the youngest roster in the NFL. I think the kind of expectation was, well, we'll keep building on that, and we'll just get better and better, and this might be one of the best teams in football this year, when we project forward that growth and that development. And the thing is, it doesn't necessarily work that way, right? When you hit the reset button in an off season, you hit the reset button, and it doesn't necessarily hold that you're going to carry the momentum from last year into the next season. You got to start all over again. And I think what we saw is when you have one of the youngest rosters in the NFL again, and not necessarily like an overabundance of star power, the Packers have this interesting roster where it's really good, top to bottom. There's not many weaknesses on it, but it doesn't necessarily have the star power, the incredible elite players across the board that some other rosters do. And when you have that, sometimes you just hit this level. And if Jordan Love is not going to play, all pro level football all the way through the season, whether or not it's, because of injuries, like if he's not going to carry the team with that kind of play, then they're kind of good, not great. And it sort of felt like their season was, they're going to beat most teams in the league, but when they run up against the truly elite teams in particularly in their conference, when they run up against the teams that are vying for that number 1 seed, that's when they came up short every single time. Like every time they ran up against one of those teams that was either a contender or looked like they were about to be a contender right up until the end, they were just found wanting. They just weren't as good as those teams. I think that was a pretty accurate reflection of their season, really. They were good, but they didn't take that step forward towards being great.
One of my most disappointing, there's a lot of disappointing aspects of losing to Chicago in that last week of the season. They had nothing to play for, obviously, but one of the things is it broke the narrative of literally every sort of easier team that they played. They just won. They just beat them every single time. And every really good team that they played, they basically just lost every single time. And that was the story of their season, is they were right in that middle tier of like, hey, if we get a good matchup, we're just going to win it. And if we get a tough matchup, we're probably going to lose it. And that's obviously, it's not a terrible place to be in, but it leaves you wanting for more. And that's where I think Green Bay kind of hits this offseason. And you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of Packers fans were going into this offseason saying, all right, you've got a good team. You don't have many weaknesses. You've put yourself in this position actually to maybe go a little bit big game hunting and maybe try to acquire a star player that never really came to fruition. I think the market didn't exactly make it super feasible. Maybe a DK Metcalf trade would have been possible. Obviously, Pittsburgh gave up a ton to make that happen. Maybe there's a couple other things that they could have done, but instead they end up with Aaron Banks. They end up with Nate Hobbs, more good players to help this team, kind of consistently be good everywhere, but maybe not those star players that a lot of people were hoping for. What did you think that Green Bay needed to do in this offseason, and what did they actually accomplish or not accomplish?
Yeah, well, free agency's become difficult now because those star players, the big game isn't necessarily out there anymore. Teams have gotten so good collectively at managing the cap, at understanding how free agency works, that you just don't get the same caliber of player hitting the open market that you used to. So if you're kind of waiting for free agency and you're like, man, we've got, we've got a war chest here. We've got some spending money. We're looking for some stars to come in. Most seasons, I don't anymore. That's just not going to happen. And even, when Green Bay have opened the pocketbooks previously, it's been for those sort of non-valuable positions generally. Like Xavier McKinney, you could argue is a star caliber player, but he's at a position that teams don't typically commit the big money to, right? But if you're trying to find, an elite number one wide receiver or an elite caliber left tackle or another elite pass rusher, like they're just not getting exposed to the marketplace anymore. And so even guys like, Milton Williams, who's good, but is he like Milton Williams was clearly the second best penetrating, pass rushing defense tackle on his own team a year ago.
Yep.
And yet Milton Williams is like the star of free agency, right? Like that's the problem, is that the Jalen Carters aren't going to hit the open market anymore. The Milton Williams of the world are. So if you're Green Bay and you've got like a pretty good roster of these good players, but you're going for the star, it's not going to happen in free agency. So you either have to find the trade, and I think you are going to see more and more of that, right? That's where these deals are going to happen. It's the teams willing to shed a contract for a draft pick. They're not willing to let that guy walk for nothing, but they might be willing to let him walk for a third round pick. So they're getting into that world and, playing in the DK Metcalf trades, the Debo trades, those types of deals that we've seen. Or you're going to have to do that in the draft, and you're going to have to try and find those players in the draft. And that either you got to draft well, right, where you're picking, and the Packers are in this uncomfortable world where, they're good enough that their position in the first round is typically going to be in the second half of it now.
Yep.
So you're kind of usually out of the blue chip star power type of world already. Or you get into that, is there a player that we like enough to be aggressive and go trading up for them? And that just gets into an uncomfortable world of, is that sound process, period, right? That question mark. Like generally speaking, the data says that chasing trades up in the draft for non-quarterbacks is a very risky game to play, but that's how you find the big game that this team might be looking for.
Yeah, very much so. And we also live in a world where Brian Gutekunst is usually on the risk averse side when it comes to that stuff of trading away draft picks or moving up. And he wants more draft picks, not less. And it does end up in this sort of interesting situation that unless you do hit on some of these first round picks, which has been an issue with Eric Stokes, Quay Walker, Devontae Wyatt, we'll see what happens obviously with Jordan Morgan and LVN to an extent as well. But they have not hit on those early first round picks. And that has been a bit of an issue for this team. So we're going to have to see how Green Bay can go about acquiring a star player, finding a star player, because like you said, they're not really coming available in free agency. Goody is not usually one to trade draft picks and a huge contract for a player. And you look at the draft and he's usually not trading up. And like you said, they're going to be in the second half of the draft. It just makes it very, very difficult.
Yeah. And, so it doesn't need to be a first round draft pick where you find the star either. Like those guys are available late in the draft. There's a better chance in the first round. But the broader point being, you got to find the stars in the draft, right? Because you're not going to be able to buy them in free agency. They're just not hitting the market anymore. You could trade for them. You could package your draft picks, go find the guy that's potentially available in the trade market. Or, the easiest way of doing it, and it's not easy, is to just hit on a couple of draft picks. I mean, look at what the Rams did with Puka Nacua, right? Hitting on Puka Nacua it's huge. Like that, because of the cost, because the contract that he's on, hitting on one pick like that can completely change everything. And the Rams did it, a few times. So that's where the draft strategy of Gutekunst is smart, right? Pick as many times as you can, because if you hit on one of those guys, it's transformative. If you hit on a couple in a row, it's huge. Like that can be the thing that propels you forward. And those could come, in the third and fourth and fifth round just as easily as they could come in the first round.
Sign me up for a Jared versus Braden Fisk draft for Green Bay if I could get that as well. I'll take that. Also, Rams have done a really incredible job, especially considering they're coming off the FDem picks era where they got rid of so much. Some of the stuff that they've done has been very, very impressive. Kind of going back to free agency for a second. Green Bay did obviously dabble in free agency. They get Aaron Banks, they get Nate Hobbs, to a lesser extent, McCole Hardman. Your thoughts on what those three players could bring to Green Bay?
I really like the Nate Hobbs signing. I think Nate Hobbs is a really good player. I'm a little concerned by kind of the makeup now of the secondary in terms of like they almost have the reverse of the secondary version of the Buffalo Bills receiving core, where everybody looks like they belong in the slot. Well, the Packers DBs almost look the same, right? Everybody seems like they operate in the slot. I would love one guy who you're like, I want him playing outside so that I can move these guys back into the slot, because I think Hobbs is best in the slot. I think Nixon is best in the slot. I think Bullard might be best in the slot. So all of a sudden you've got like this embarrassment of riches of guys that all might be plus tier slot defenders, but somebody's going to have to play on the outside. I would assume it's probably Nate Hobbs at this point. I think he's good at that. I don't think he's great at that, whereas I think he's great in the slot. But overall, I think that was a really good signing. The Aaron Banks one is interesting because it's like, it's the sort of cautionary tale of the frustration with like insider reporting these days. Cause like the initial contract comes out and it's like the agent, fed figure of the maximum amount of dollars we can attach to this signing. You're like, ooh, for that kind of money, I don't like Aaron Banks. And then
Right.
the real contract is not nearly as expensive as that. And, Banks should be a solid player for this line, a reasonable upgrade and a reasonable addition. But it's sort of the whole thing is tainted by this like initial contract number. And then, well, the contract's not as expensive as we first thought. And then as soon as you're framing the signing that way, it just doesn't feel good. Well,
Right.
the good news is it's not that expensive. Yeah, but that's not how you should be feeling about a new signing. So the whole thing just gets kind of tainted by this rush to put out ridiculous numbers to begin with. But overall, it's like it's a standard Green Bay offseason, right? Like they've added a few good players at some important positions, and that frees them up to go and draft best player available, to not have to hunt specific positions to fill needs.
The Banks contract is so, and just the discussion around it is so fascinating because to your point, it's like, well, I see a lot of people being like, well, look, they can get out of the deal in 2 years. It's like, that's great. I love the fact that they bake in some of that stuff, but if he plays for 2 years, he ends up making like 40 some million over that time. It means that he probably did not live up to the contract if you're getting off of him in 2 years, and it still ends up being maybe not the most exciting deal in the world. So it just, all of that framing is very, very interesting, and hopefully just ends up being a really darn good left guard in the NFL. And he's worth all of the money in the contract, but it is very interesting to see sort of the framing around a 4-year, $77 million deal like that.
At any time, when that's like the selling point, hey, we can get out of this deal.
I
It's like,
know.
well, generally speaking, when you're signing the players, like the selling point should be how good he is, not
Yes.
how easy it is to get away
Get
from the
rid of him.
contract you just signed him to.
It's so funny, but I mean, it's I like that people have the wherewithal and like the knowledge to be like, all right, well, we can get out of it at this point, and it's like, yeah, that's a good thing to bake in there. But hopefully he just plays really well and he lives up to the contract. But we'll have to see how it goes. Speaking of those contract situations, Green Bay has still a very, very interesting one, and I'm curious your thoughts on the outside looking into this, because in Packers land, there's a lot of differing thoughts. But Jaire Alexander, as we're recording this on a Tuesday. This is probably going to air a little bit later in the week, but as of right now, Jaire Alexander is still on this Packers roster. There's not been a resolution. Apparently he's on the trade block. How do you see this going? And are you surprised that it's gotten to this point?
I'm not surprised because not because he's not a good player or he hasn't been a good player, but because clearly the guy's a bit of a lunatic. Like I can understand why contract negotiations with Jaire Alexander become problematic at some point, that are independent of his quality on the field. He's obviously also dealt with some injuries and, not necessarily been the player that he has been at his peak the entire time. So these are all reasons why, if you're Green Bay, these are stumbling blocks towards a new contract or more money or all these kinds of things. So I kind of get it, but working against that is the fact that he's still the best corner they have. And it's already like a potential weakness on this roster because of what we mentioned earlier, like this collection of slot defenders and a relative dearth of guys that play outside. Well, if you then take Jaire Alexander and trade him away, even if you get a draft pick back, well, now nobody plays outside except, Nate Hobbs is playing outside by default. Like, but effectively everybody we have is a slot type of player first. And we could theoretically need to add 2 outside corners to be in a comfortable position with this roster. So like, it's an awkward position to be in for Green Bay. I think the best thing for everybody would be some kind of contract resolution that keeps him in the building. But I also get, if the right trade offer comes along, those are from a sort of team building process, philosophy standpoint, those are the smart thing to do is to keep taking those deals and, work through the draft, get younger, get cheaper. But sometimes that does involve some short-term pain before you see the positivity from that.
No, big time. And I think, like you said, he's clearly the best cover corner on the team. And there's a huge difference. And again, the issue is, of course, that Jaire's played 50% of his games over the last 4 seasons, which goes into this as well. But when he's out there, I mean, this secondary is a lot different connotation if it's Jaire and Hobbs and Nixon and Bullard than if it's just Nixon and Hobbs and Bullard and Valentine, I guess, to that extent. But it definitely looks and feels a lot better if Jaire Alexander's out there. Again, even when he's on the team, him being out there has been a bit of an issue as well, which I think is why this is the conversation. We talked about corner. It's not necessarily the only hole that's on this roster. A lot of people talk about maybe that number 1 wide receiver for Green Bay, or at least a field stretcher with Christian Watson being out, better pass rush. Well, what do you see as maybe some of the holes that remain on this Packers team as to how they can get better? And how would you maybe like to see them attack those holes in the draft?
Yeah, I mean, corner is the one spot, again, because of everything we just talked about. Even whether or not Jaire Alexander is there, I'd love to see them add a second corner that they would be comfortable starting on the outside. If Jaire Alexander departs, that becomes like the massive need, the glaring need that almost needs to, like, that puts you in the position that you don't generally like being in, where you almost have to spend the first round pick on that position because the need is so acute. So generally speaking, I think corner is a pretty important one. The defensive line is interesting because, like, they added a lot of guys in the last couple of years, young bodies that have each sort of shown something, and then none of them sort of played to that level or developed, or, the progress from that group was backwards last year. So whether it's, Carl Brooks, Lucas Van Ness hasn't really lived up to that billing, Kingsley Enagbare, like, none of those guys performed at the level you would have wanted them to last year. So this offseason, from a team building point of view, you look at that depth chart and you're like, well, we still like those guys, but are we at the point where we can rely on them now? The sort of core of Gary and Wyatt and Kenny Clark are still good, but those guys need to improve from a year ago. Otherwise, we need alternative solutions. So I think some kind of contingency in the draft for that group would be smart. Trying to bring in another edge rusher that can make an impact would make a lot of sense. The receiver thing is interesting because I think clearly if they found a number 1 elite wide receiver, that would make an impact. But again, it's like, where are you getting those guys from, right? They don't hit the open market in free agency. They, if you want to trade for one, it's going to cost you a lot, and they're not particularly abundant. Like, teams are not letting those guys free.
No.
And then the draft, I think that's the relative weakness of this receiving core as well. Like, there's not it's not like last year where there were 3 of those sort of guys sitting there in the top 10. And then, Brian Thomas Jr., who ended up being one of those guys as well, projected a little bit lower. This year, there might not be one at all. Travis Hunter might be the only guy that can do that. But I think it's worth taking a swing at a guy that you think can either be that number 1 guy or a sort of specialist vertical threat that you think, well, he's not going to be a number 1 guy, but at least let's round out the skill set of the core in the aggregate and say, put all together, we've got a number 1 skill set. It's just distributed amongst the varying different groups. So those would be the positions, like, definitely defensive depth on the D line and a cornerback. And then let's try and round out that receiving core's composite skill set.
It feels like they're going to have to moneyball that wide receiver core and get something in the aggregate that looks all together like, all right, individually, any one of these is like meh, but together it's like, all right, we can put something competent out there. But it's going to be interesting to see. They usually don't obviously go first round in the draft at wide receiver. And like you said, it's a little bit of a weakness anyway. I'm interested to see what they add to that room and if they can at least get a vertical threat, which is going to be something they desperately need with Christian Watson starting the season off on the injured list because of that ACL and MCL injury at the end of last season. We kind of talked about where Green Bay was last year, what they have and haven't done this offseason. But as we start looking ahead to 2025 and the season upcoming, what are your expectations? Twofold. One, for the Packers as a whole, and then maybe most importantly, I think one of the real interesting aspects of 2025 in the NFL in totality is Jordan Love. And can he be that quarterback that you win because of, or is he that quarterback that you can win with? And I think that's a huge differentiator for him as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, they're in a similar place to where they were a year ago. They look like a good team right now. It's incredibly young still, so it really comes down to what is the overall net improvement from this young group, right? Do they get better collectively, hugely? Do they split the difference? Do some of these guys regress? Some of these guys get better and we're in the middle, or do they actually not improve that much at all? And suddenly you went backwards relative to the other teams in the league. But I think overall it should still be optimistic. This should still be a good team. And then the draft is still, upcoming to add some more talent to it. The problem I think that they face is that it looks like on paper the rest of the division got even better. The Vikings is kind of they're tough to gauge because on the one hand, the biggest departure or loss that they had was quarterback, right? So it moves the needle more than anything else. On the other hand, the rest of the roster looks like it got a lot better around the quarterback. So it's tough to say that they definitively got better, but they were surprisingly good last year relative to expectations heading into the year. If they came close to like maintaining that, they're a good team. Chicago looks like they've gotten significantly better with the coaching additions, the offensive line additions, the trenches additions. Like, they're unlikely to be as bad as they were a year ago. And then Detroit don't look like they're getting any worse. So this could be the best division in football again next year, which just makes it tough for, a team like Green Bay. If they don't clearly take a step forward, it's a nightmare division to be in. And in any given year, you could lose a couple of those games to teams that you're theoretically better than. And then all of a sudden you're like 9-7 or, 9 wins, 9-8, and you're not making the playoffs. And it looks like a disaster, but only because like everything around you was a really difficult assignment. So I think generally they're in a good spot. And then Jordan Love, he's one of a number of quarterbacks that's in this world right now where I don't think we quite know what he is, right? And we treat quarterbacks like it's a static thing, in any given, this is what this guy is, period, and he will always be that. But it's always a movable thing, right? Like Jordan Love might have a year where he's in this world of you can only win with him, not because of him. But then the next year, it might be a year where he's the reason you're winning those games. Right. Like, he's clearly got that ability. We saw that a year ago. And even if it didn't happen consistently last season, I think he's shown that he has that level of play within him. And that, that alone is something that not that many quarterbacks have. So yeah, he might be a streaky quarterback. He might be inconsistent, or he might just have dealt with injuries. Like, his sort of sample size is still extremely small. So, I think we just have to wait and see what he's going to be long term.
I just hope we get a healthy Jordan Love this season so we get a little bit more clarity on exactly who and what Jordan Love is, because we've seen, like you said, some signs of some really impressive stuff, especially healthy at the end of 2023. 2024 is completely marred by injuries. The first half of 2023 was completely inconsistent. So it's just like the sample size, like you said, is so incredibly small, and trying to figure out which Jordan Love is the real Jordan Love has been a little bit tricky. So I'm just hoping we get a little bit more clarity on that. And then, of course, winning some games would be nice as well. You talked about the division, obviously. I think there's a couple interesting things. Obviously, the Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson leaving Detroit, getting Aiden Hutchinson back. I think I'm sure you as well can't stress enough how important that is for Detroit, and just the way he was playing prior to injury. That's going to be massive for them. And then in Chicago, you mentioned upgrading the trenches, Ben Johnson going to Chicago. And obviously, I think getting a little bit of an upgrade in the overall coaching staff there. And then I think the big one, though, is, as of now, JJ McCarthy as the quarterback in Minnesota. How do you I mean, it seems like he's going to be the starter again. Maybe by the time this airs, something has changed. There's been a little bit of Ryan Tannehill talk. It seems like the Rodgers thing is done there, but I'll never put it to bed until he signs somewhere. How do you see that going in Minnesota? And do you think JJ McCarthy can be the guy there?
Yeah, I mean, I think he can be. Before the season last year, he was winning that job. Like, Darnold was brought in to be the bridge, but the bridge was only ever expected to be like a month. And then by the way he'd played in training camp and preseason, albeit, really small sample size, JJ McCarthy was, I think, winning that starting job by week 1. And then suddenly coming out of a relatively impressive preseason performance was like, everybody feels good. And then actually, by the way, McCarthy's hurt his knee. Oh, that's not great. And then the knee turned into, actually, that's going to shut him down for the year. So
it's crazy.
Kiss goodbye to the season already. But like, I think coming out of that game, he was going to win that starting job by week 1. So I don't think there's any reason they wouldn't trust him to be the starter, given the way it was going. Like, assuming the recovery from that knee injury is good, assuming everything physically checks out, based off where he was before the season started last year, before he got hurt, he was going to have that job anyway. And the only thing that would have stopped him is Sam Darnold, and you already let him go somewhere else. So that's not even the alternative option. Now you're looking at it and saying, well, would you voluntarily interrupt that for an Aaron Rodgers or, and I maybe, but I doubt it. So I think anyone they sign from now until the season is going to be like a contingency plan. It's going to be like, what if McCarthy starts and then he's terrible for the first while? Like, what do we do? I think that's the type of quarterback they're in the market for, not a, who can we bring in who's actually better than McCarthy? I think it's basically his job to lose. And then their eye on the veteran market is, well, what if he does lose it?
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I was pretty high on McCarthy coming out. I think he can be a very good quarterback, especially in that system. They've got Kevin O'Connell and Josh McCown, who have been very, very good at kind of building structures for quarterbacks. So I think it's going to work well. And they've done the thing where you've got a rookie quarterback on a super cheap deal. So go out and spend a bunch of money and build the roster around him. And they've certainly done a very good job of that as well. And I'm with you. I think this is going to be one of the toughest divisions in football again in 2025, which should make for some very entertaining games in the NFC North. Sam, I cannot thank you enough. Actually, really, really quick, Ireland game coming up. Maybe Packers, Steelers, maybe Packers versus Aaron Rodgers. We'll see what happens. But what are you expecting for that game in Ireland?
Yeah, the Packers are certainly a team that everyone's talking about. Nobody will confirm it, but they're the most common rumored opponent for Pittsburgh. I mean, I think it'll be incredible. Croke Park with it's an 82,000 stadium, but they'll have to put seats on Hill 16, so it'll be lower than that by some margin. But like in the range of high 70s, 80,000 people in that stadium. Dublin's done amazing hosting college football games and high school games and stuff. I think it'll be an amazing occasion, that game.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. It's going to be a ton of fun. If it is Packers, I'm going to try to get out there, but it should be awesome. Speaking of awesome, I cannot thank you enough for your time. It's always a pleasure chatting with you and breaking down NFL and all things Packers. What's cooking at 33rd Team, and what do you got coming out that you want to plug on the way out here?
Yeah, check the mic. All draft all the time right now. We're starting draft ranking. So tomorrow is quarterbacks, Thursday is receivers, and really all draft all the way up to the draft.
We'll be looking forward to it. They do a tremendous job covering the draft. If you don't check out their draft coverage, you're definitely missing out. Make sure to follow him at Sam Monson NFL. You can find me at Andy Herman NFL. You can find the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. That's going to do it for Sam and I today. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.